Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm supposed to stand in this kind of podium to kind of be in the camera shot, so if I'm a little further away than I would have liked, I apologize for that. I think this kind of session is titled Storytelling with Data, and that's what I'm going to take about the next 2 hours to kind of talk through. But the idea is not to be really just a monologue. I would prefer to have it as a dialogue. So feel free to, there are 2 mics, I think, with the audience mic, so anytime you have a question or you have a thought or a question that you would like to ask, please ask, because probably the person sitting next to you also wants to ask that question, is probably hesitating. So just feel free to kind of jump in and ask, and that would make it much more lively, because then you may be able to connect more with the context that's in your head, right? So I think my kind of background is kind of what is already been covered, but I want to kind of start with how I got into this, right? How did I really get into storytelling? And I used to work as a management consultant. So I used to work for A.T. Kearney in India and Booz & Company in Europe for about 6 years. And I used to there work with an ex-Navy pilot who was a partner of mine, and he was kind of, I did a lot of projects with him. And being from a kind of a Navy background, he would use a lot of kind of war metaphors to tell about how to run a project or how to do the projects, right? So he would probably, when we say, okay, if you want to go and convince a client or persuade a client what you want to do, you want to tell him war stories. You want to tell him the stories that you fought the war, you have fought the battle, you have the wounds to show for it, and you can kind of take them across their battle that you're fighting with them right now. And that kind of stuck with me. But I was like a young consultant, with not many battles that I've really fought, so not that many stories to tell. So the other metaphor that we would then use is to create a killer chart, right? So again, kind of continuing with the war metaphor, a killer chart. And a killer chart was really something that is not really, one chart after the other, but one chart that kind of shows what possibly can happen, or kind of tells an idea about what is a possibility there, or gives some hint. So kind of kills some of the questions that there may be in the mind of the audience, or the client in this case. And that's where it kind of stuck with me in terms of war stories and killer charts. And I really wanted to, when I came back, I wanted to really learn more about it, bring my experience in consulting, teach, and also learn as process teaching in kind of management context, design context, even data science context that I kind of teach these days. And that's where I come from. So that's kind of where a lot of what I will talk comes from through my journey, right? And you may have a different journey, and if your journey is different and you have some questions about it, just kind of raise your hands, and you just kind of ask, and I will take it in between the session. So I will pause at some moment and explicitly ask for questions, but even between that, if you have questions, just ask for that, right? So I'm going to start with a story. And I'm going to tell probably 2 or 3 stories through this session. This is a story about Joshua Bell. And Joshua Bell is one of the leading violinists in the world. And he would play in concerts. And when he plays in a concert, a ticket would go for as much as like $1,000. And when he plays in a concert, like if you play in like a classical music concert, there's typically prenup silence, right? Nobody makes a move, because if you make a move, the musician is probably going to look at you very funnily, or you maybe get thrown out. So there's a lot of credibility to the musician on the stage. And then in 2007, Joshua Bell decided to go and get out of this concert hall and go into a subway. A subway in which he was basically busking. And he was busking for about 30 minutes, 35 minutes, and trying to play the same violin, the same songs, probably about 6 or 7 songs that he played. And he was really disappointed because nobody stopped to listen to the same classical music that he was trying to play, right? Not really nobody. 6 people did stop, drop in some money into that. A kid stopped. One lady did recognize him and dropped a $20 note, but if we exclude that, he probably earned less than $20 through that entire episode. So what happened? Why did people listen to him, pay $1,000 and listen to him in an audience in a music hall, but when he goes into a busking stand and playing the same music with the same passion on the same $4 billion violin, nobody is stopping? What changed? Why were people not persuaded to stop? You can answer. Exclusivity, okay? So if it wasn't exclusive enough, I'm sharing this with all the people that are walking out. Any other? I'm a patient guy, I can wait. The concert already? Okay, so they paid the money, they want to pay for the face that they're going to go and listen. Yeah. Just a little louder if you're staying without the mic. Yes. So this is all the disinterested people who are walking in the subway towards, right, including everyone who don't want to stop. The ambience, the audience acoustics, or the auditorium acoustics are not really the same in a subway. I've heard people in the subway. I find them still better than the auditorium sometimes, but yes, fair enough. Nobody knew that he had this big label on him, right? Like this label of a great musician that he was kind of talking about. Okay, so good. We can go back and really look at, all of these are really valid answers. And if you go back maybe about 2,000 years and you were to ask Aristotle how you persuade people, he would probably, and he wrote the treatise on persuasion called Rhetoric. And there are 3 things you need to persuade people. And in this case, he's really trying to persuade people to stop with his music. You need the logos, the logic that appeals to people, the ethos, which is the credibility that appeals, that you are credible, you're trustworthy, yes, that you have the label of the musician, I paid $1,000 to listen to you. And you also need an emotional connection, a pathos, which is not probably there when you're running to work in a subway, right? So you need all 3 of these elements to really persuade people. And rhetoric is really what was one of the original subjects. So in the ancient Greek, they don't teach the 3 R's, like reading, writing, and arithmetic. They would teach grammar, how to construct a sentence, logic, how to use that in a logical argument or logical sentence, and rhetoric, how to persuade people by your ideas. And persuasion is what we're trying to do in many of these cases. That's why we want to come back to storytelling, or we want to use storytelling as a way of persuading people, right? And that's because we inherently, humans, are pattern-seeking storytelling animals, right? So these are the 2 basic instincts that we have. We're good at pattern seeking. That's why we are visually wired to look at patterns. We can identify patterns. We are much better at identifying a pattern than maybe a computer still is in many cases. And we are naturally driven or attracted to stories, right? So we are inherently a pattern-seeking storytelling animal. And that's why one of my theses is that instead of trying to think about analysis, we need to think about synthesis. Instead of trying to think about numbers, we need to think about how to visually show it so that we can appeal to the pattern part. And instead of really thinking about how do I have an argument around what I'm trying to tell, how do I tell a story that I can appeal to the people? That's really the crux of what I look at storytelling with data, or that's why I am really passionate about this. And if I was to say why I work in this intersection of data, story, and visuals, is really trying to be in this intersection. Is there a way that we can combine these 3 things in a way that we can then persuade people? You can do one. You can use data. It probably would be still dry. You can just combine data and visual and create a graph, and you may not still be able to. But if you can combine at this intersection, then you can probably be much better at persuading people. And that's my thesis. I also feel that when you work at the intersection of different arts, there is much more that you can do, much more you can learn, much more you enjoy doing it, much more there's opportunities to do rather than just doing in one small bit of just saying, I want to do deep data analysis or I want to do data visualization, for example. Right? Does that make sense? No? Yes? Kind of? Sort of? Okay, so if we buy this thesis, and I do, that comes to the next question. So, okay, now we want to tell a story. What is a story? What is a story? Who wants to tell a story? What is a story? Yes? That's just because I said persuasion is not that we only want to persuade people. Yes, but no, not necessarily. You may not be only trying to persuade, you may be trying to entertain. What really is a story, or what is a narrative? Like, narrative is just kind of the more studious way of saying the same thing as story. So a sequence of events, connected events. That's pretty close. Narrative, or the word narrate, is any kind of connected events presented in a sequence of either words or spoken words, written words, pictures, moving pictures. And that's what a story is, a narrative is. And narrative comes from this Latin term narrare, which means to tell. So you're trying to tell people how these connected events happen, right? But is that really enough? Like, does that sound good enough as a story? Like, is that good enough? Yes? No? It has to have a logical something. Okay? Any other ideas? It should make sense to the audience, who you're telling it to. Yes, they should make a connection. Let me tell you a story. This is a story about David Ogilvy. David Ogilvy is one of the original Mad Men. Anybody sees Mad Men here? Mad Men? Like 2.5 hands. Okay, tough crowd. So David Ogilvy is like the Mad Men is basically the ad men in the 1960s in New York, and who would basically write the advertisements. And David Ogilvy was like one day, and he basically set up O&M, Ogilvy and Mather, which is one of the bigger advertising firms, I think probably part of WPP now. And David was one day walking in New York. It was like a bright day, very nice. The sun was shining. You could smell flowers in the air. And he was walking down to his office, and he saw a beggar. And the beggar was blind. So he had this placard on him which said, I am blind. And he had this kind of cup in which he would ask for people to give him money, and he would, from time to time rattle it to hear how much money is in that cup. And David was in a good mood, so he dropped his contribution and said, can he make some changes to the placard? And the beggar, obviously very happy for the contribution, said, sure. So David made some changes, and he went to work. In the evening, when he was coming back, the beggar was really happy because his cup was full. His cup was full, and he could not understand why people were giving him so much money that normally they would just walk past. And then he was like asking David, what did you write that people are now wanting to give me money? And David said, it is spring, and I am blind. So just a simple change in copy. Now, obviously, David Ogilvy is a copywriter. He's good at writing an ad. A simple change in what was probably a plea of help converted it into something which was much more emotional, right? And that's what we're trying to do with storytelling, is to elevate. Roger Ebert uses the word of elevation. There's an elevation that happens when you listen to a story. And that elevation happens, if that happens, then really when you connect to a story. There are 4 key elements of when you really say a story is something that you can connect with. One, obviously, is that it happens in time. So there's a linear order, which is kind of what is implied by the definition of a connected event. So that it happens in a linear order. But that itself is not enough. You need to have some named people, entity, person who goes and makes a decision, has to face a decision, a personal journey that somebody goes through in that story. That's why stories are very personal, right? And you make some decision. That adds much more emotional connection to it. That also is not enough. You also need a disruption of the state of equilibrium, or something that happens. There was a context, something happened, triggered something, and then there is a new equilibrium that happened. There is this movement within a story that really helps move it. And the final thing that you need in a story is really a foregrounding of human experience. This is where elevation comes from, the way that you can then connect with the story that you would otherwise not. So these four elements of ordering, decisions, a human experience, as well as a change in context, all these four come together to make a story, right? And once we do that, we can actually connect with it in a way that you would probably not connect with, say, just statistics or just numbers, right? And that's why I am really attracted to stories in a way to communicate and persuade that we can use. And storytelling is not really new, right? I mean, all of you have seen storytelling, read storytelling. You've been probably told stories when you were growing up. You've seen oral storytelling, word storytelling, pictures, movies, comics. And we can all learn from a lot of these elements in storytelling before we bring it to what we are trying to do with data, right? So if you were to think of what happens in the story, somebody said when the listener connects to it. That really comes from oral storytelling. When you tell a story, you already have a connection to the story. I, as a teller, also has a connection with this audience, which has probably been established in the last 10 minutes that I'm talking. But what I really want is the story to connect with you. And that's something that I have far less control on, right? That's kind of the storytelling triangle. And what I'm trying to do is sow these seeds of story with kind of transferring the imagery of my story into your head so that you create your own story in that, and then you form a bond that is really happening. And that's really the storytelling triangle that you're trying to get people to. That's why stories are powerful, because you may go back and not remember numbers that you heard, but you may remember a part of story because it's kind of transferred as an imagery into your head, right? Stories also have an arc, which is kind of what the change of equilibrium is. You can say a story has a beginning, a middle, and end. You can also say they have like a setup, and then there is a conflict that happens that moves the story from kind of the current equilibrium to a disturbed equilibrium. And then you have this long middle part in which there is a trial and tribulations to kind of struggle to kind of get to the new equilibrium, coming to a climax where you would then probably end up in a resolution that starts the end of the story, and now you're at a new equilibrium. So this movement from one equilibrium to another equilibrium is when you have a story, and this movement of emotions is really what you're trying to do when you try and create story arcs. Right? Comics. Comics and movies are also great ways to look about stories, because comics, literally by the box that they draw, wants you to focus your attention, and that's what stories also do. They focus your attention onto a path of the story. You are listening to it. You'll never find in an oral storytelling more than 2 characters, because you cannot keep more than 2 characters in your head. So you would always have a way of focusing attention that really happens with this. The framing that happens in a comic or that happens in a movie is really around trying to get your attention and focus onto what's happening on the screen and not away from it, right? It's very different from putting text on a slide and saying, okay, now I'm telling you what the slide is, right? That's very different. This is really trying to get your focus and attention there in a way that you connect with the story, because if your attention goes away, the story will not really work. So the whole idea is from start to finish to have like a visual and a verbal journey that you can connect with, right? And there is a cognitive flow that is established once you can connect both visually and orally with the story. And once that's established, there is a possibility for you to remember, to retain, and possibly even recall the story. And that's when you have managed to make the connection to the listener. One human life closely observed is everyone's life. In the particular is the universal. And that's another element of the story. Stories, because they're personal, even though they're so personal to an experience, there is some universality about it that you are still attracted to it. You can see the universal aspect of it, even though they are personal about it, right? Very different from what we would do, and I'll come to when we do talk about data, when we try and do data, when we try to deal with aggregates. We try to tell the whole picture, but not really deep dive into a one particular aspect. But in a story, you'll find the more personal it gets, the more easy it is for you to connect with that. So, any questions? Any thoughts? Before I move to kind of how we bring this together from with storytelling and visualization. Does anybody like doing storytelling of any form here? Half hands, okay. Anybody has kids, they tell stories too? Anybody, people use the term big data. Has anybody heard of the term called thick data? No? What is thick data? It's a new buzzword. Any guesses? What's thick data? Complex, okay. So if big data is 100,000 numbers, or let's say 1 million data points, how big is thick data? Or how small is thick data? People do read stuff outside of the financial services here, right? Thick data is basically when you go and do an ethnographic research with a very small sample size and carefully collect stories about their usage, their behavior, or just observe what's happening as they interact with the product or with the data that they have, right? With the whatever you're trying to research, which is the diagrammatically opposite of big data. It's not IoT, it's not something that's flowing in with tons of thousands. It's really focused collection of stories through observation with which you can understand user behavior or ideas much differently than you would with big data, right? And that's probably the academic way of kind of really collecting stories around product development or even ethnographic research to that example, right? So how do we bring storytelling and visualization together, right? If you're convinced that stories have an impact, stories is something that we can use, and we should try and see how we can bring that with the data and the visual part of it. How do we do that? So one of the ways not to do is not to throw a chart with text together and say this is now a story, right? Refer to figure 1 on page 23 is probably not the best way to try and do storytelling with data, right? This is one of the pretty nice blogs, The Graphic Details by The Economist, but just the way they use it is still largely text-driven with 1 or 2 graphics to kind of support the story in the text, right? And the idea here is to kind of turn this around, not to think chart first, but to kind of think stories first and then see how we can find the charts or how we can find the visualizations to support it, right? It's also not doing complex visualizations. It's not trying to create the most complex, interactive piece of, using latest JavaScript framework, whatever you could figure out, visualization. That is probably applicable, but it's not, it's not really telling a story. It's still another way of visualizing, right? The idea is to move away from averages, movements, no views, literal stuff, determinate stuff, to something that's more like a story. So something that's very individual. That's really jumps out of the story. That's kind of the data portrait that you want to show. Something that's has a point of view. Maybe even is open-ended and metaphorical in the sense that it invites people to make interpretation more than what you are trying to tell, right? And the idea is to combine data and visuals in that way to kind of tell a story. So there are two ends of the spectrum when you're trying to create data stories. And there are really two ends of the spectrum. Nothing is pure, as in life. But there's really something that's really explanatory in nature, which is really narrative, where you're trying to tell, or it's really exploration, where you're inviting people to explore the data in a very layered way so that they can find the stories within them. The second one is much harder to do. So the more left you are in this kind of spectrum, the more easy it is for you to create data stories. So just a quick couple of examples, and then we kind of look at that. Suppose a very trivial example, something that people can connect with. If you were to look at kind of the smartphone, tablet, PC environment or ecosystem, and you were trying to tell that story in a very simple, single frame kind of way, how the two dual ecosystems have emerged, you'd probably start from, and this is all interactive, but I'm showing it in a more static way. You would probably talk about 2010 when a tablet has just come into the market, where there's probably 14 million of tablets, 12 of which are iPad, that's just come into the market. And if you were to look at the colors, the blue is largely the Windows market, largely dominant. The oranges are basically RIM and Symbian stuff that probably doesn't exist or is minuscule now. But if that is how the smartphone, the tablet, and the PC market would look like in 2010. And within the next 4 years, you would see that the green is starting to dominate. So you can now really see visually that actually Android is probably picking up, the Windows part is really shrunk out, and Macs, which are the grays, are doing well. And in another frame, probably which is with 3 frames, if you were to project it out till another year, you can clearly see that Windows is probably gone, and we are now in a dual ecosystem kind of world with two ecosystems dominating in that way. And given that Microsoft just shut Windows yesterday or day before, it's probably going to be grimmer than this actually is, right? So you can kind of tell a very simple data story using just one visualization and weave it in a very narrative way if you want to, right? And that would be really not annotation so much, but more like the talk that you're doing, right? So like the verbal annotation that you would do to support the story. But largely in three snapshots, you could probably tell this whole story very effectively. And you can make different people the heroes in the story. You can make tablets the hero if you want to and tell the story. You can make PCs the villain or the hero, or the Windows not the hero of the story and tell the story, right? Or you could also do something which is exploratory, where you're not trying to tell a story, but you're trying to figure out where, for example, another simple way, where do people live? Or where are all the pin codes in India? There are about 26,000 plus pin codes in India. And you can map them on a map with different alpha densities to show where there are more pin codes, where there are less pin codes. And if you could type the digits of the pin code, you could start to see the patterns that they are geographically dispersed, right? So if you type 5, for example, you can start to see that covers Karnataka, AP, Telangana, at those 3 states at the moment. And then you can make it more interactive. As people zoom in, they can keep typing in, and they can come to where they really live in that story. So this part is really around the idea not being to allow me to tell something very prescriptive, but provide an interface in which people can interact and find something that they're interested in. So if I was to search in there, I would probably figure out where 5 exists, which are the 6, 7, 8, but there'll be no 9, because there's no pin code that starts with 9. So I will even find stuff that I'm not aware of, that there are no pin codes that start with 9, because 9 is army, so 9 doesn't really exist. So even the lack of data could probably tell me something about the story. So those are the 2 ends of the spectrum. And you are really trying to be picky about where you want to be. You either want to be something which is very explanatory in nature, where there is a strong order. You have heavy messaging that you're trying to tell the story. You want to build in as limited interactivity as possible, because you want people to go through that narration in a very singular fashion. And it is really author-driven in the way that I am trying to tell the story. I am trying to persuade. The flip side of that is something which is really interactive, in which you're trying to set a very weak order, have some light messaging that allows people to kind of navigate through it, but it's really driven by what the reader wants to investigate. So they can go down different paths. And this is much harder. This is much harder to convert stories or build stories. Video games have tried to build, authored, public-driven stories and really failed at it. Because it's really hard to create stories in which the audience has a far bit of latitude to do stuff, right? Because stories are inherently brittle in nature. So, how many of you have seen Hans Rosling's, any of those videos? 5, 7, 8. Okay. Fairly small. So the reason a lot of us talk about storytelling with data is because of this guy. And we can look at him telling since many have not played, I can show a short clip. And we can look at how you could tell a story and learn from what a narrative story could be. And then we can build into it and to say how we could develop stories around that.
Visualization is right at the heart of my own work too. I teach global health. And I know having the data is not enough. I have to show it in ways people both enjoy and understand. Now, I'm going to try something I've never done before. Animating the data in real space, with a bit of technical assistance from the crew.
So, here we go. First, an axis for health. Life expectancy, from 25 years to 75 years. And down here, an axis for wealth, income per person, $400, $4,000, and $40,000. So down here is poor and sick, and up here is rich and healthy. Now, I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago, in 1810. Here come all the countries. Europe brown, Asia red, Middle East green, Africa south of Sahara blue, and the Americas yellow. And the size of the country bubbles show the size of the population. And in 1810, it was pretty crowded down there, wasn't it? All countries were sick and poor. Life expectancy were below 40 in all countries. And only UK and the Netherlands were slightly better off, but not much. And now, why start the world? The Industrial Revolution makes countries in Europe and elsewhere move away from the rest. But the colonized countries in Asia and Africa, they are stuck down there. And eventually, the Western countries get healthier and healthier. And now we slow down to show the impact of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. What a catastrophe! And now I speed up through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in spite of the Great Depression, Western countries forge on towards greater wealth and health. Japan and some others try to follow, but most countries stay down here. Now, after the tragedies of the Second World War, we stop a bit to look at the world in 1948. 1948 was a great year. The war was over, Sweden topped the medal table at the Winter Olympics, and I was born. But the differences between the countries of the world was wider than ever. United States was in the front, Japan was catching up. Brazil was way behind, Iran was getting a little richer from oil, but still had short lives. And the Asian giants, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, they were still poor and sick down here. But look what is about to happen. Here we go again. In my lifetime, former colonies gained independence, and then finally they started to get healthier and healthier and healthier. And in the 1970s, then countries in Asia and Latin America started to catch up with the Western countries. They became the emerging economies. Some in Africa follows. Some Africans were stuck in civil war and others hit by HIV. And now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the middle, but there are huge differences at the same time between the best of countries and the worst of countries. And there are also huge inequalities within countries. These bubbles show country averages, but I can split them. Take China, I can split it into provinces. There goes Shanghai. It has the same wealth and health as Italy today. And there is the poor inland province Guizhou. It is like Pakistan. And if I split it further, the rural parts are like Ghana in Africa.
And yet, despite the enormous disparities today, we have seen 200 years of remarkable progress. That huge historical gap between the West and the rest is now closing. We have become an entirely new converging world. And I see a clear trend into the future. With aid, trade, green technology and peace, it's fully possible that everyone can make it to the healthy, wealthy corner.
Well, what you just seen in the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown over 200 years and beyond. It involved plotting of 120,000 numbers. Pretty neat, huh?
Pretty neat. It is pretty neat. Obviously, it doesn't talk about the challenges of just getting the data. Who knows, what was the life expectancy in Ghana in 1893. There's a lot of stuff that goes behind it to create something as good as this. And forget the technology. The technology is just show. But there's a lot about storytelling that we can just pick up from there. And if anybody doesn't follow Hans Rosling, they can. He has lots of good talks around a lot of data storytelling, especially around the health economics kind of scenario. And I'm going to just pick up 6 or 7 points to just highlight from the talk to kind of what we can pick up about storytelling from just there. One of the first things he does, which we rarely do, is frame the setting. We never set the frame of what we're trying to talk about. There are 2 axes here. He describes both the blocks. He explains in a way that's really understandable to me. He never talks about that one of the scale is actually a log scale, 400, 4,000, 40,000. But he does explain it in such a manner that you understand what the setting is, what the frame of the whole picture that's going to be about, right? And then he introduces the characters. He tells about each of the circles and what color stands for, and kind of introduces in a way that you can start to recognize them. Then he provides the context before he starts. So to say, okay, who was on top? UK, Netherlands was really on start, and provides the context about the story. So what is the initial context that's there in the story? And then he starts the transition, where you can then start to see what is happening over the next 200 years. He pauses in 1948, adds humor to it, really makes it much more anecdotal at that point, and then tries to create some tension in the story around what are the divergent, what are the extremes in that case are, right? Shows the climax about what would happen, but then doesn't stop here. It goes down and looks at additional arcs to the story. So what would happen if you just break China and kind of split it into smaller stories, right? So it's not only one main story, there are other stories that are also emerging in it, which is very likely. When you are telling data stories, there will be one major arc, but there'll be other stuff that you may want to cover. And then he provides a resolution in terms of what would happen eventually as this moves on, right? Obviously, very well done. But there are a lot of elements of storytelling in creating something which is still a fairly large data set, tediously collected, put together, and created in a very nice motion chart where there are at least 5 dimensions that have been shown on this visualization, right? So how do we create data stories, right? So Hans Rosling can do it. That's good. How do we do it with stuff that we have? Like if we have data and we want to try and create something around it. There is no guide to do this. There's unfortunately not an AI system that can actually do and sit and create data stories. They can point to it for now. But there are some things that we can keep in mind when we try and do this, right? So when I think about data stories, I think about these 7 things that we can think about when we're trying to create one. We think about abstraction, representation, aesthetics, framing and transition, messaging, flow, and interactivity. And these are more 7 guiding principles around how to go about creating a data story. Right? So abstraction is really the hardest part. This is where, based on whatever you're trying to do, the analysis, descriptive, inquisitive, exploratory, predictive, causal, mechanistic, whatever type of analysis you're doing, at the end of that, you have come up with something, an abstraction of the data that you want to communicate. Right? So whether it's a pattern, whether it's a trend, whether it's an outlier, whether it's really about deviations. You have a nub of a abstraction, the data abstraction that can represent the reality that you want to really communicate, right? This is really the hard part. I mean, this is kind of the 80% of the effort that would probably go in doing the work, right? So it's the hard part about creating and getting this abstraction and being clear about it. And yes, you can do it very pragmatically, hypothesis-driven. There are many ways to do this. But you need to come to a place where you have an abstraction that you can then communicate. Once you've chosen an abstraction, you need to think about how to represent it. What are the options to represent it? And I'll cover a little bit in the later part about how to visualize, how could you learn visualization. But in the story context, stories really have kind of 5 or 6 types of questions, like who and what, how many, where, when, how, why. Those are the kind of questions you have in a story that you want to represent, right? And if you were to think about charts or that kind of correlate to this, the who and what are really around portraits. You want to show the portrait of a distribution. You want to show a portrait of the data. It's really around the distribution, a distribution of the data that you want to show. Or when you're saying how many, it's really around comparisons. How do you want to compare one versus the other? A comparative representation. When you're talking about where, it's position in space, whether it's idea or it's a spatial representation or geographic representation. Whether it's a timeline, it's really position in time. And then when you're trying to show relationships and networks, that's really around figuring out flows, hierarchies, flowcharts, and many ways of showing that. And the final one, which is really the most interesting one for me, is really why. When you're trying to show, or when you have a killer chart, which you're really trying to point to something, either a deduction or a prediction, where you're really trying to say why something is happening, right? Most of us do very well at the who and what kind of charts. We really don't do so well at the why kind of charts. And the why kind of charts are the really interesting ones, right? This is Amanda Cox, New York Times graphic editor, who really says, if we can get better at the why kind of charts, we probably have a good story to tell. Really have a good story to tell. Once you figure out the representation part, you need to think about aesthetics. So you've done the abstraction, you have the representation, and now you want to aesthetically show it, right? And aesthetics is not only just color, even though I'm using color to show it. Aesthetics is really about visual design. It's about proximity, similarity, contrast, repetition, subtraction, all those design principles that very few of us, especially coming from the engineering background, really get good at it, right? A very simple representation, this is bad aesthetic, this is good, right? There are principles that you can learn just to go from here to here. And it's not just about minimalism. You can do maximalism kind of thing and still have good aesthetics. Minimalism does really work well for engineers like us because it keeps us safe. Because the first principle of aesthetic is above all else, do no harm, right? So don't do something that will really make it bad. If in visualization position is everything, color is very difficult, even for the best of us. So first of all, do no harm is what I would suggest. So go towards the more minimalistic side of this in aesthetics. Adopt a minimalistic stuff that can really help communicate and not distract in the way aesthetic graph like this would from a story that you're trying to tell, right? Those 3 are still something that we are comfortable with, we've kind of figured out. The next steps are much more harder. So how do we frame a story and how do we do transitions around the story? What is framing a transition? You typically won't have only one chart to tell in a story. You would have multiple charts, and the idea is to move from one frame to another, right? And if you go and look at the example that Hans Rosling was doing, it was really on a single frame. Here's another example of a single frame, all the stores of Walmart and Target in the US. The idea is if you do it in a single frame, and if you have luckily time as your one of the variables, you can actually move across time and show a lot of changes just across time, and in a single frame show everything. Single frame are the easiest ones to do because it's easy to maintain people's attention in that single frame. It's easy to focus on it. You are also not likely to go down different paths. You're in a single frame and you can tell that whole story. If you can't do that, you need to do what in filming or movies would be called establish and focus. Think of 2 people going into a diner, having a coffee. You have an established shot where you see the 2 people talking, and then after that you only have 2 people, one shot of the single person drinking and talking and the other person, right? That's kind of like establish and focus. So you set the overview, and then you go down and focus on the details, right? This is not something new. Ben Schneiderman, one of the guys who's written amazingly well on interactive visualization, overview first, then zoom and filter, details on demand. That's kind of one of the principles of data visualization. And if you can figure out a way to do either single frame or establish and focus, you probably have a story. You have got your framing and transition in play, right? And transitions don't necessarily only have to be about time. They can be about drilling down, zooming out, contrast, intersections, really an outlier story, or a factor story. So you can have different kinds of transitions that you do within the data. But try and figure out a way that you can constrain to either a single frame or establish and focus within those transitions that you have. And you can probably take the same data set and create these 6 or 7 stories if you want. Stories, though, don't really happen just because now you've got the visualization to story, right? To tell a story, you need words. You need to have the messaging. You need to have the messaging, whether it's verbal or whether it's annotation. And when I say messaging, I'm not really talking about legends and labels. Those are the bare minimum to just establish the chart, right? What you really want is meaningful annotation. So there is a New York Times article on a century of meat. It's not like just the title itself is talking about what's happened to meat consumption across a century, has got a brief monologue or a brief story about setting the context, and then meaningful annotation at different points to really highlight what triggered different changes within the consumption. So why did chicken go up? Why did beef go down? Why did fish stay where it was? And that is what meaningful annotation is. This is one way to do it. You can also add icons. You can use legends, labels to enhance. But the idea is really if you want to tell a very static story, you need to have a very meaningful annotation. Or a very scripted story in which then you have to be a powerful narrator and you really tell the story and narrate it and really script it and then tell it out. And both mediums would be needed. When you do a static one, you would need meaningful annotation. When you're trying to do a presentation and communicate in either a video or on a stage format, you'll need meaningful, a powerful narration to go with that, right? There's always room for a story that can transport people to another place. And that's what you're trying to do with messaging. You're trying to build that story that then people can really relate to it, which you cannot just do if you just stop at the first 3 parts, because you'll be left with a pretty-looking graph and maybe even transitioned 3 graphs, but there won't be a story for people to follow through, right? The final 2 things are really around flow. A couple of people who work in data visualization, like in an automated way, and really want to go full-fledged into automated way, I had a couple of dialogues with them, and they wanted to really take and say, can we construct automated stories? Can we really construct stories that come out of that? And actually, if you look at stories that are generated as press releases and all, you'll find that they never look like stories. They just look like transcript. It's like running Word summary, and then you get a summary of the document. Well, more intelligent than that. But flow is really when you do the editing. It's kind of like a movie is made on the edit table. A data story is made on the editing and the flow, where you figure out what works, what doesn't really work, right? And this is the hard part about kind of figuring out, and this is where a little bit of experience would help. The more linear it is, the more story-like it is. So this is an out of sight, out of mind award-winning interactive, very simply done about the number of drone attacks in Pakistan. Very nicely done, very linear, with very little text, but tells a very powerful story. Or you have to help the audience, and this is about gun deaths in the US and what is the amount of life that was lost because of those gun deaths, right? So again, trying to tell, and to figure out these flows in the story takes a little bit of time, a little bit of practice, a little bit of experience to figure out, and a lot of editing. Because all stories are indeed structures, so you can have archetypes of a story, and you can construct around that, but all the best stories are brittle structure, which means they're constructed by a lot of editing, a lot of maneuvering to say, okay, now this fits in the context that I'm trying to tell. This fits in this context, and I can tell that story. Otherwise, if I take it out or take this element out, the story will fail. The last part about interactivity, luckily for narrative stories, interactivity has to be really simple. You need to have very simple linear navigation so that people can move from one part to another. So it's kind of comparing Facebook's offering of IPO. But the story we told in 5 frames is just linear navigation to kind of tell the story. Or if you use PowerPoint or use Tableau story points, they're kind of designed in a way that stories can be told. And that's why even though we look down on slides for that matter, slides are the greatest tool for telling a story because their linear narrative structure is already built into it. It's probably how we use them that really fails us rather than actually just the tool itself. And in some cases, you may want to break the story down and stage and animate it if people find it hard to follow, right? So that is the other area where animation or staging or animation can help and where interactivity really helps in, where you have a possibility of breaking it down so that people can follow something which is a complex visualization much more easily as they see the transition from one graph to another. That's what staging does. Dan Norman, who writes a lot on design of everyday things, so has this term called affordance. And whatever interactivity you build in your story should have affordance. That means it should be easy for people to use. If they can't figure out what the interactivity is, they will not use that element of it. So really, you should give them a clue of what the interactivity is and really build that story. So if you kind of do these 5 or these 7 steps, you can probably move from something that's just a data to something that is more like a data story. How many of you can relate to any of these points? Some of these points? None of these points? Some, okay. 1 supporter, 2. Okay. Any thoughts? Any questions on this doesn't really make sense, I've tried this doesn't really work. All this interactivity stuff is really useless. Or I've tried this tool and this is really good at creating data stories. Or I've tried this at my office last time and then my manager didn't really appreciate it. Or did appreciate it. How many of you do this kind of creating a story to persuade? Like, I'm not talking reporting or dashboard creation at this moment, but more like you want to communicate, you want to present a 5-minute pitch or a 3-minute pitch to someone, and you work on it for 2 weeks. Does anybody do that? No? No? Okay. How many of you think you're good already at doing this stuff? Show of hands is the easiest I can get a response from you. Who thinks they already have the skills to do this? Like, you know. Yeah? No? What do you think is the skills needed to do this? Like, is this really an art? Is it a science? Is this something that we can really automate and, you know, we should just get away with this? Like, you know, you can just, I should be redundant talking about this, or, you know, we should just get an AI system or a chat bot to do this, or whatever is the latest. Or is this something that is more an art? Is it a science? Is it an art? Who thinks it's an art? Okay. 20. Who thinks it's a science? Okay, there are some supporters. Okay, and who thinks it's neither? Yeah? I actually think it's neither, to be honest. It wasn't really a flippant remark. I think it's a craft. It's somewhere between an art and a science. And that's really what a craft is. What is a craft? Anybody does any craft here, like, you know, play music, do pottery, paint, design? What is a craft? Yeah?
Probably craft is something where you have a set of rules but still creative. So it does not just go by the rules. There are a set of things that have to be kept in mind, but then it's all your creativity.
Okay, so there's a bit of rules, but you have a lot of leeway to do it. Okay? Any other thoughts? Those people who said it is neither, what do they think is a craft? No? Who paints hair? What is a craft? What is painting? It's art, okay? So there is no rules, there's everything, like according to his definition, there are no rules, you can do whatever you want. Which is probably abstract painting is probably a lot like that, there are no rules. But if you do portrait, maybe there is a bit of science around how to draw human anatomy around it. Well, craft, at least according to the dictionary, is an activity involving skill in making or doing things by hand, right? So since the premise here is that to create a data story, we need to have a human in the mix. So human in the mix has to be required both for, we don't need humans in the mix to create the visualization, but then somebody has to look at it, right? That's what I mean, human in the mix, to do that, right? So it involves somebody actually doing something to do that. And that's why I think it's more of a craft. How do you learn a craft? Practice, okay. What else? You start straight away with practice. You learn the steps, okay? So before you practice, you learn the steps. What else do you do? Search and see what all is there. Get inspired, yeah. Really get inspired around it, yeah. So get inspired about it, learn the basics, then practice, right? That's pretty much it, right? Actually, you start, this is from Kalaripattu, which is like a Kerala martial arts, which I'm trying to learn, unsuccessfully so far, but it's a journey. You look at somebody doing it and you get inspired by seeing what they're doing. So there is like typically a novice or an expert relationship. Especially in crafts, at least in the olden time, there was like somebody who's a master at something and you go and learn from it. Doesn't necessarily have to be there. Now you can have Khan Academy to replicate that. But in some contexts, you still need people who have done it, who have some experience of doing it, who can teach it in a master-apprentice relationship. Or you just get inspired by it, right? So you see all these data visualization, you see all these data stories around that, and you're inspired to say, I want to learn it. Like, I want to know how to do this stuff, right? Is there any ideas on how to actually do that, right? And you start with the basics. You learn the basics. You know, you learn really the basics around that skill that you're trying to learn, that craft you're trying to learn, and then you do repetition. You do that over and over again. You do that over and over again, and not just over and over and again like a mule, you know, without any thought in it. You do what is called as deliberate practice, right? So you have some feedback loop around it. If that 100,000 or 10,000 hours of practice will make you an expert at anything is true, it's not just doing it without any feedback mechanism, right? So you do it with a feedback mechanism that really allows you to become better at it, right? And then the idea here is you're not practicing it for somebody else, you're trying to focus on mastery. You're trying to get good at it just for your own sake, to become good at telling that story. That's really how you learn any craft. You really want to focus on mastery as a way of kind of the end bar on really trying to learn the craft, right? So we can think about how to do that for data viz, right? And if Picasso says it took him a lifetime to do this, we also have a long time to learn any skill or any craft or to get good at that. Right? So how do you start? How do you start on this journey? Right? How do you start on this journey? I'm going to share a small clip. This is a very small clip about somebody trying to learn the djembe for the first time. And djembe is an African drum instrument. which I play. So a lot of the stuff is just my experiences and how I learn different crafts and different things, and I'm trying to weave that in. And he's trying to pick up how to play djembe for the first time.
Hi.
Sounded good, Walter.
I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry. That's what it's there for. I was lying on my bed listening to my music, and then I was like, what's that crazy rhythm I'm hearing? Sit. Come on. I'll show you. Just put your feet flat on the ground. Now take the drum between your legs like this. Now you want to take the inside edge off the ground with your ankles like this. Great. Feel okay?
Okay.
Okay. Now, Walter, I know you're a very smart man, but with the drum you have to remember not to think. Thinking just screws it up, okay?
Okay.
Now give it a couple of bangs. Not so hard, you're not angry at it.
Okay. I'm sorry. Okay.
Better. Did you think?
No.
Good. Now one more thing, Walter. You listen to classical music, so you think in fours. 1, 2, 3, 4. Da, 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 da. This is an African drum, so we're going to be playing in threes. Tak, tak, tak. You have to forget your classical. Leave it behind. Tak, tak, tak. 1, 2, 3. Come on, follow me. Tak, 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 tak. 1, 2, 3. Don't worry, start again. Good. Don't worry. Again. Good. You got it. Go on.
I'm sorry.
Don't worry.
I'm sorry.
Don't worry, go again. Good. That's it. Now keep it going and I'll do this. There you go. Ah, ah.
Anybody who wants to learn the djembe now? It's not that hard to, it's deceptively simple to start with, which is true for most folk instruments. But if you look at what he was trying to teach it, he was trying to teach it in many different ways. Can you pick up like the ways he was trying to teach how to play the djembe? No, he actually said the opposite. He said, don't think in your mind. Thinking just screws it up. So he said, yeah, but he put thought away in this case. Don't do it for data viz, but in this case, put thought away. What else? He tried to teach it in many ways. Say? Somebody? He gave him an example. Yes. What example did he give? By playing it, you mean? Sorry, I didn't get that. Say that again, please. How to play that. Okay, yeah? He taught it in 3 or 4 ways, actually. He verbalized it. He said da, 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 instead of tak, tak, tak. He said, because in classical you think in 4s, in African, you think of threes. So do tuck, tuck, tuck. He actually played it. He literally played to show him how to play the djembe. He was trying to teach it that way. And he talked about, instead of threes, things of four, or four versus three. And then if he was trying to teach him the Western classical way, he would have used kind of a notation to do it, right? And there are these four ways of thinking about or teaching about things, right? These are learning styles. And if you think of kind of verbalization, that's linguistic, that's very verbal. If you are using numbers, it's symbolic, math logic. Playing literally is actually interactive or kinesthetic in this case, but in our computer-driven world, it is what we would call interactive. And then the last box on the right, on the bottom part, geometric, which is really visual spatial, right? Which is again what visualization does, right? All these four are different skills. All these four are really different learning styles, and all of us are good or are good at it at different proficiencies. So one of the things before you try to pick up a craft is also to understand where you are on these learning styles. What are you good at? What are you not good at, right? When I went to learn the djembe, for example, my teacher would say, just play. And I was like, I can't just play. He would say, okay, then verbalize it. And I was like, I can't really verbalize it. And then I figured out I need to really see the rhythm, literally see the rhythm, and actually then later visualize it in my head, the visualization that happens of the pattern in my head before I could do it, right? So I need to figure out my learning pattern to learn any new craft. And that's one of the things that we need to do when you start to think of learning any new skill, or you want to learn a craft or data stories, is we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are, right? So understanding your own learning style or your own strengths in this is really important to say whether this is something that I want to pick up or not, right? So how do we learn data visualization and storytelling? How do we get better at learning storytelling with data, right? You start with learning charting. You learn the very simple data sets and start to chart them on a very regular basis, right? You kind of start at that level. And once you figure this out, you learn kind of the basic charts that are there. And if you were to think of quantitative variable, categorical variable, and the combination of all of those, quantitative, categorical, quantitative, and represent them using points, bars, lines, areas, you would probably have a very small matrix of really useful visualizations. And you get good at doing this, right? A lot of you may already be good at doing this. Once you figure this out, you then understand the aesthetics of it. So how can I design a basic chart? So what are the elements in a chart? What are the charts elements that I can really play around with, right? So what are the aesthetics that I can need to do much more than just the visual representation and get good at doing this part, the basics of this. And then move to expand your chart vocabulary to kind of all possible combinations of these charts. So what is a choropleth? What is a cartogram? What is a dawdling cartogram? What is a circular radial graph? So all these possible, you can expand to this level, and then you go up to one more level in visualization, right? But that's not really good enough. If you really want to understand visualization, then you need to say visualization is actually the transformation of the symbolic into geometric, right? So you need to understand the basic behind it, right? So you need to understand how to think in geometric forms and not just charts, because chart libraries are inherently limiting, right? So if you really want to become a designer of new ways to represent stuff, then you need to think about geometric shapes. So how can I encode data with shapes and colors? And once I've encoded, then how do I position them out to show different visualizations? And once you know that, which is nothing if anybody's done the grammar of graphics, is you learn the grammar of graphics. And once you learn the grammar of graphics, you can visualize in unlimited ways of showing anything, right? Once you've done that and you're good with it, you then go into the next level of kind of playing with colors. So how can I use color much more effectively to represent data? So this is the same pin code map represented as an orange, has different shades of color for the same map, or different gradients of red for the same pin code representation. You understand how visual perception works, and you develop an aesthetic sense. So maps are really great at representing aesthetics much earlier than they are what we do right now. So if you go to look at any old cartographic map, it represents far more detail and depth using color and shading and everything than than we probably represent using even our basic simple charts. So you develop an aesthetic sense around that, right? And you learn to see. You learn to see not only in kind of the stories that we were talking about. So I talked about stories and how, there are stories all around us. You can find stories in verbal, in oral, in movies, in comics, and bring that part. But you also learn kind of how I could represent stuff differently from looking at, let's say, nature, so different stuff in the nature, or architecture, or even abstract art. So, Piet Mondrian or Kandinsky, and you get inspired by that to say, okay, what are the other possibilities to represent data? What are the ways to communicate stories? What are the ways to represent data? And then you go up this ladder of really figuring out how I can actually tell better stories. Sketch, really sketch a lot. Pen and paper is the fastest and still the best prototyping tool that you have. If you want to be good at visualization, you can really sketch a lot. You sketch and really form ideas much before you actually translate it into whatever computer-generated tool you're trying to use. And then you go up the visualization ladder to say, okay, I move beyond the simple visualization. I want to visualize wide data sets. So, instead of 1, 2, 3, 4 variables, how can I do 10, 20 variables? Or I want to visualize large data sets, which is like creating generalized histograms. Or I want to get better at geographic or spatial data sets. Those are the kind of the three skills you'll build up once you have figured out how to do the basic visualization stuff. Only after that you kind of move to the layering part of creating data stories, in which you think of how I can create a multi-layered static visualization. This is the kind of work I do with design students, where they're trying to communicate a much more complex story in a very static narrative, or do the narrative visualizations that probably are even more valuable in your communication and persuasion too. And the other two are really around dashboard and interactive, which really require much more typically coding experiences than you would rewrite. So this was just, I wanted to share not only why stories are important, how you can create some of them, but also kind of what could be a journey that somebody could take to move as they develop their skills around this, right? You may also want to get comfortable with not just one tool, but many tools that stretch across the canvas, from canvas tools, which allow you to do everything that possibly you can visualize, to grammar tools, which allow you to work with the grammar, to something that allows more visual analytics, to something that allows charting, right? So you be comfortable at least one tool in each of this bucket, so that you can then, depending on the data complexity, the project complexity, kind of figure out which tool you want to use to communicate your story and create your story around that, right? So I'm going to end with just a few, what I think the 3 elements that you really need to get good at this chart, data, story, visual, right? I strongly believe that all of us need to be, especially if you want to be good in this space, need to be a bit of a data scientist, need to be a bit of a visual designer, you need to be a bit of a storyteller, right? If you are good at all 3 of them, then jackpot. But at least build the basic capabilities around each one of them, right? And obviously and also understanding the limits of it. So data is obviously just a clue to the end truth, so it's not the whole thing, but you at least have a way of looking at data to understand what's happening. So it's an abstraction, which has its own power and limitation, gives you one representation, possible representation of what may be happening, but you understand that and you're curious to look at new things from a very kind of data-driven lens, right? So that's what I mean by a data scientist. I don't really mean you spend all your time in R and Python trying to figure it. You're really curious about looking at the world through a very data lens. You understand how aesthetics are really connected with emotion and feeling. So you want to create beautiful aesthetics. You want to present your work in an aesthetically appealing way because you know that that has an emotional connection that you can't just get just by using raw numbers, right? So you are creating beautiful aesthetics and you're getting better at this visual design part of it, right? And the final thing is really the data is just part of the story. The story is the main thing. Data should enrich it. It's not about the latest network diagram that you can draw, but it's really about how I can enrich the story with the data that I have, right? So you're trying to tell stories that connect, and you get good at that element of that. It is not easy. It takes a lot of time in any creative work that you do, and I'm sure all of you do lots of creative work. You would know that you begin as a beginner and you feel like there is this big gap, and you don't really know how you would be able to close that gap, right? So I'm just going to end with this short clip from Ira Glass, who does This American Life, talking about how people can get good at telling stories and then done creatively by someone else, visualized very creatively, called Closing the Gap.
Nobody tells people who are beginners, and I really wish somebody had told this to me, is that all of us who do creative work, we get into it, and we get into it because we have good taste. But it's like there's a gap, that for the first couple years that you're making stuff, what you're making isn't so good, okay? It's not that great. It's trying to be good. It has ambition to be good, but it's not quite that good. But your taste, the thing that got you into the game, your taste is still killer, and your taste is good enough that you can tell that what you're making is kind of a disappointment to you, you know what I mean? A lot of people never get past that phase. A lot of people at that point, they quit. And the thing I would just say to you with all my heart is that most everybody I know who does interesting creative work, they went through a phase of years where they had really good taste, they could tell what they were making wasn't as good as they wanted it to be. They knew it felt short. It didn't have this special thing that we wanted it to have. And the thing I would say to you is everybody goes through that. And for you to go through it, if you're going through it right now, if you're just getting out of that phase, you got to know it's totally normal. And the most important possible thing you could do is do a lot of work. Do a huge volume of work. Put yourself on a deadline so that every week or every month you know you're going to finish one story. Because it's only by actually going through a volume of work that you're actually going to catch up and close that gap. And the work you're making will be as good as your ambitions. It takes a while. It's going to take you a while. It's normal to take a while, and you just have to fight your way through that. Okay?